Now let's continue with the slightly more complex Tetris pieces. Remember when I told you to save the first piece we made, because we'll be reusing it later on? Well, now's the time to reuse that piece, so bring it in, or take a minute to redraw it. What we'll be doing now is creating a more detailed looking piece, and to do that, we are gonna need to play around with creating different trapezoids, making them look as if they were different angled planes, and changing the color like we did with the 3-dimensional pieces. So select the top trapezoid and remove the stroke, and give it a completely white feel. Do the same with the one on the right. Now for the one at the bottom and on the left. Do the same, but this time give it a full black. Now you can safely delete the square in the middle, the one we used as a guide to build the trapezoids on top. If you have problems selecting it because it's below the other shapes, just hold Alt and click on the stroke till you select it. Holding Alt allows you to select objects occluded by others. We want to be able to see the square in the bottom through this square hole. You'll see why in a minute. Here comes the interesting part. Pick the top trapezoid and go to the Fill and Stroke dialog. Fin the alpha slider, the last one, and start lowering the alpha of the white color. That is the transparency, till you kinda can see the bottom color. In this case you can see how it started showing the green color through. This is gonna be the highlight. We wanted a lighter green, but instead of giving it the color directly by assigning it a lighter green shade, we are using a transparent white shape on top to tint the color to a lighter green. Repeat the same step with the other white trapezoid, but this time lower even more the alpha slider, till you get a shade in between the highlight and the color of the base square. This side has a darker highlight to imply that the light hits less this plane. Now repeat the same steps with the black trapezoids. You'll want the darkest plane to be the opposite of the lightest, so lower the alpha accordingly. And this is how it should look. It should give the impression that each trapezoid is a different plane, with the light hitting the planes at different angles. But you may be wondering, why tinting? Why not just give the right color straight away? Well, here comes the really cool part. At any moment you can select the base square and change the color. And the cool thing is that, because we use neutral colors with transparency for the illumination, they will automatically adapt. So I'm super quickly creating different color variations of the entire square simply by changing the color of a single object. If you played around with the colors, you should realize that not all color hues react the same with the highlight and shadows. If you give the base square a naturally lighter color like yellow, it may blend too much with the highlights. The same if you give it a naturally darker color like blue. The shadows may not react as well. This is because different hues have different natural lightness levels. So what I recommend you to do is to pick the color you like, and if you see the highlight or shadows are blending in too much, make some quick adjustment with the alpha slider to maintain the relative distance between them and the hue. Now that we are working with slightly more complex pieces, this is where it starts to get interesting. You could change the proportions of the planes, the roundness, and especially the illumination. What planes are in highlights and what are in shadows. So here are some variations I made. Okay, now let's make the most complex piece style. This one that looks really shiny and detailed. The techniques you learn by making this piece will give you a ton of flexibility to create pretty much any type of piece you may ever want. So start with the square. Remove the stroke and give it a nice looking color. Just like in the previous piece, We'll be using transparency so we can super quickly and easily change colors after it's been created. Build the same shape as before, create the square in the middle and then the trapezoids. If you don't remember how to do it, rewatch the last lesson. Now it's time to give them color, but this time instead of using a single color, we'll be using gradients. This is what will give them this nice looking depthness and detail. Select the top trapezoid, go to the gradient tool, make sure this little button is selected. This button will create a linear gradient. The other one, the one that says radial gradient, will apply a gradient in circular form, which will be really nice to experiment later on. Also make sure that this other little button is selected as well, so you can apply the gradient to the fill rather than the stroke. Now drag a straight line vertically from one edge of the trapezoid to the other. I recommend you to hold Ctrl while you drag. This will apply a constraint so you can drag the line completely straight. And by default the tool will create a gradient between the two ends, called stops. That will be the selected color on one stop and the selected color but with the alpha slider completely turned down in the other stop. Let's change the colors. To do so you need first to select a stop. To select a stop you can either click on it with the gradient tool or select it with the node selection tool. Selecting a shape with the gradient with the node selection tool will show you the gradient line with the stop so you can edit its position by moving each stop. Give the two stops white and make sure they both have full alpha. Now the trapezoid is completely white, but what we are gonna do now is lower the opacity of both. So select the upper one and lower the alpha quite a lot, to about 1/4 of the alpha slider. As far as the other one, lower the alpha to about the 3/4 point, in such a way that the upper stop is way more transparent than the lower stop. Now you should adjust the opacity of each stop so the transition is nice and pleasant looking. You want a clearly defined transition between the strong highlight and the weak highlight. Now follow the same steps with the one on the right. But now, just like in the previous piece we made, make the overall highlight of the side plane less strong. So make both tops a bit more transparent, while still keeping the clear transition between strong highlight and weak highlight. For the bottom plane it's the same, only that you should use black instead of white. This plane is the overall darkest plane. Put the darkest shadow on top and transition it to the slightly less dark shadow on the bottom. Follow the same process with the other plane in shadow, but again make it overall less dark than the bottom plane. Now it's time to give a gradient to the square that makes up the top plane. What we'll be doing is making a gradient that contrasts with the upper and lower planes. So give the top stop full black and the lower stop full white. Now play with the alpha of both. What you want is to give the impression of a subtle depression in the plane, so make sure that the highlight is lighter than the top plane, and the shadow slightly darker than the bottom plane. It's almost done, but to give it a nice looking detail, pick the pen tool and create this line between this diagonal where the light should be coming from. Give it white color and lower the alpha a bit. This is supposed to be the sharp highlight that often gets captured in the corners. Make it a bit lighter than the other highlights. Highlights in corners tend to be really intense. Also make sure to give it the correct width. This is a highlight that is supposed to be captured by the edge, so if it's too big, it won't look right. Now create with the pen tool a line for the highlight for the other two corners. But instead of lowering the opacity, because the illumination on the right side should decay a bit, and the illumination on the top should stay strong, we're going to be using a gradient. Remember that you can apply gradients to both the fill and stroke. So click in the gradient tool and click on this little button here. This will set the gradient to be applied to the stroke color. The fill won't be affected at all. Now drag from the top corner to the bottom. Give both stops full white. The top stop should be almost full alpha, and the lower stop should have no alpha at all, effectively making it completely invisible. This way the highlight fades, giving the impression that the light is hitting the side more indirectly. Overall, all these transparency adjustments should be made by pulling the camera way up and seeing how it looks from there. Remember that these tiles are gonna be really tiny on the screen of the user's mobile phone, so set the color and size keeping that in mind. And it's done. The really amazing thing is that this type of piece, just like the one before, will adapt to the color that you set the bottom square. If you have trouble selecting the color due to being shapes on top, remember that you can just alt-click to select obstructed shapes. And just like the piece before, most of the selected colors will work just fine. But some will require you to go in and adjust the transparency of a few shapes. This style of piece is by far the most complex one you'll be doing, but it's also by far the most interesting one. You have a lot of room to improve and make a ton of variations. You could, for example, use radial gradients instead of the linear ones we used, or you could alter the design. Now it's up to you to apply these techniques to create your own nice looking pieces. And to end this lesson on pieces, I want to create a particular style of piece that you see all the time in some Tetris inspired block sliding games. I call it the textured piece. Most of these block sliding games have pieces built of a single shape, like the fake 3D piece we made before. So by using the square to better measure the proportions, duplicate it and build a common Tetris piece. And then perform a union by selecting them all and hitting Ctrl+. Now I want to create the outer planes that we've been using to imply different planes. But because the object is not a perfect square and the sides are not equal, I can't simply duplicate the shape and scale it like we did with the squares to create the inset. Lucky for us, there is a command that allows you to offset any type of shape. So duplicate the shape and go to Path, Dynamic Offset, or use the shortcut Ctrl+J. Then scale a bit with the little white circle. Depending on the shape, Dynamic Offset may smooth a bit the corners. We don't care about the inner shape. We need it as a guide to create the trapezoids. So a quick solution would be to just eyeball where the corners will be where it's rounded. And that's exactly what I'm gonna do. Now it's just a matter of giving them the whites and the blacks and setting the transparencies. So let's give this shape some kind of texture. I've seen a ton of games use this wood style for this type of puzzle games. So let's add a wood texture to make the piece look like it's made of wood. The first step should be getting the texture. Of course, you could easily Google wood texture to get a ton of images, but the problem is that if you want to use any of those textures in a commercial project, you may run into a few problems regarding copyright and that type of things, we'll be modifying those images and pretty much making them almost unrecognizable. But just to be sure and avoid any type of problems, I wouldn't use them in a commercial project. The alternative, if you don't want to pay for a commercial stock site like Graphic River or Shutterstock, is to find royalty-free images. There are a ton of royalty-free stock images and texture sites out there. In fact, I'll leave you in the resources a few links to some of the best sites I've found. However, I guess that for practice, there is no problem in getting images from Google. So I'm going to import a nice wood texture I have here on my desktop, which, by the way, I leave it in the resources of this lesson, by clicking and dragging from my desktop to the program. This is a nice little feature that the program has. You can just drag your images from the operative system and the program will recognize them and import them. But you could have gone to File, Import, and find your image there to import. As far as this little dialog that appears when you import an image, just click OK and don't pay attention to it. It just has a couple of image quality options. The default settings are perfect. We're going to overlap this texture on our piece. But for this we need to use a couple of new options that you can find in the Objects dialog. To open it, go to Object, Objects. This dialog is really important for handling objects. It displays a list of all objects currently in the document, including layers, groups, paths, and images. But what really is important here is that you can apply blend modes and other effects to individual objects. A blend mode is a special effect that alters how the color of an object interacts with other objects below. Don't worry, it will make sense soon. So select the image you imported and go to the blend mode dropdown. Here you have a list of all different blend modes that will be applied to the selected object. So pick the blend mode overlay, and you should see how the image kinda shows through. This is because overlay is designed so you can overlay textures on top of other shapes. Notice how the color of the image interacts with the color of the piece in a convincing manner, as if the texture in the image now belongs to the piece. Of course, you can still select the piece and change its color. The effect is applied to the image, not to the piece. Almost always you will want to play around with the opacity slider. This works similarly to the alpha slider, only that here you can apply the transparency to the entire image. I should also mention that I found that the overlay blend mode is enough for the simplest texture overlays. But you should definitely try each of the other blend modes and experiment and see if some other one gives you nicer results. The multiply blend mode is particularly good for mostly light or white images, and the screen blend mode is really good with mostly dark images. Getting a nice result is a matter of playing around with the right blend mode and juggling with the opacity slider and the color of the objects below. Now, this will be a good time to make some adjustments, scale and move the image, and make it fit with the piece below. Great, we're almost done. But now we have to deal with the leftovers of the texture. The texture is a rectangular form and is clearly not limited to the silhouette of the piece. There is a quick technique you can use to do just that. We are going to be using a clip. First, select the objects that makes up your piece and duplicate them. Now you should have a copy of all objects that makes up your piece on top of the texture. This is important. With all the objects still selected, perform a union by using the shortcut Ctrl+. If you remember, a union will join all objects into a single object. So now you have a single object instead of the piece plus the other trapezoid shapes on top. This is a requirement for the next step. Now select both the piece on top plus the image. Then left click and go to Set Clip. The clip is a way to limit the visibility of an object to the silhouette of an object above. That's the reason why we duplicated and merged the piece, so we can limit the visibility of the image. Now there is this texture with the exact shape of the piece. You can still use the object selection tool and move and scale it around. And what's more important, you can also keep refining and changing blend modes and playing with the opacity and all. And that was it for overlapping texture to shapes. Now you can get a lot of flexibility with this technique. You can apply pretty much any texture you find online. And if you are subtle with the blend mode and the opacity, it'll look great. So experiment with this technique. You could use it to apply a different type of texture or add in a nice looking noise effect, or maybe to give particular details like cracks or other features. And the great thing is that this technique works with all the other pieces as well. So play around and experiment with these features. That's the best way to learn.